The killer lured his victim into a field alone and then killed him. The question then becomes, what has to go on in someone's mind for them to do something like this? Because this wasn't just a sudden crime of passion. He was warned first. Hi everyone and welcome back. So today we're going to be discussing a story that happened approximately 4000 BC, roughly 6,000 years ago. And this happened in Genesis 4. And then afterwards, we're going to take a look at 3 main psychological behaviors that I found when I was reading this story that I think helped contribute to turning this man into a murderer. Because thousands of years later, we still see these same psychological patterns happening in people today. And although we don't have to go through this extreme to notice these patterns in ourselves, but that's kind of what makes this so psychologically interesting, because the murder wasn't where it started. Something was happening long before in this killer's mind that went completely unchecked that led him to do the things that he did. Okay, so before the murder, you have to understand the 2 men. So Adam and Eve, they had 2 sons, one named Cain and the other one named Abel. And they take completely different paths. In Genesis 4:2, Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. Abel became a shepherd and Cain becomes a farmer. Eventually, both brothers bring offerings to God as a way of worship. So the way that sacrifices worked back in biblical days was you take something valuable and flawless from your work or your harvest and you give a portion back. So Cain brings some of his crops and Abel brings portions of his firstborn from the flock. But what happened was God looked at Abel and his offering and he was pleased. But when he looked at Cain's offering, he was not. And so because of this, this is where we start to see the shift happening in Cain. It says Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. But notice that Abel didn't do anything to Cain. Like he didn't insult him, he didn't steal from him or sabotage his offering in any way. He just gave his offering to God, probably like they always do. But this time, Abel becomes the enemy. So a lot of people actually assume that this was because Abel offered an animal and Cain offered crops. But Genesis actually never tells us that. Grain offerings actually became legitimate later on in the Bible. Hebrews 11:4 actually tells us in real detail, by faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. So the difference wasn't the gift, it was the faith behind it. And 1 John 3:12 goes into further detail and says, Cain's actions were evil, Abel's were righteous. So this wasn't God just randomly deciding that he wasn't going to accept Cain's offering today, or that he liked Abel better. His offering exposed his heart, and instead of looking inward when God rejected him, he started looking at Abel as being the problem. And that's just something to note because it is important, because when something exposes an uncomfortable truth about ourselves, oftentimes instead of asking, what do I need to change, we start looking outwards towards other people and pointing the blame at them. And that's where Cain put the blame onto his brother. But before Cain has the chance to actually act on his feelings, God does give him a warning. He says, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? Then the warning came. Sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. And I love this verse for this story because it's basically saying God is addressing Cain's behavior before it grows into something bigger. In this case, before it turns to murder. Essentially, God is saying, I know you're angry, pay attention to that. Don't you know that if you do good as well, you will be rewarded for that? And so Cain is faced with the choice to either fix himself or go about with his plan. So he wasn't unaware that something was wrong. He just decided to ignore it, but he was warned. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. And in the field, Cain attacked Abel and kills him. This is why the story reads more than just an impulsive burst of anger. There's an intentional setup here. Cain gets Abel alone and then he attacks him. It was premeditated. For the first time in biblical record, one human intentionally takes the life of another. This is where we first see it. And that's when God goes to Cain and he asks, "Where is your brother Abel?" And Cain responds, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" He knows exactly where Abel is, but instead of confessing, he gets defensive. And I think this is where the psychology of Cain begins, because there are 3 behaviors that I found when I was doing some research that closely matched Cain's behavior that really stood out to me. Okay, so just on a side note, while I was doing some research on this video topic, there is actually a psychological idea known as the Cain Complex. It's not a modern clinical diagnosis. It's a psychological term for extreme envy, jealousy, and destructive rivalry towards a sibling or a peer. The name obviously comes straight from Cain and Abel. Okay, so the first psychological pattern is called the narcissistic injury. A narcissistic injury is just a clinical term for a wounded ego. It's what happens when something deeply threatens your self-image or your sense of importance. So Cain brings his offering, Abel brings his offering. Abel's was accepted and Cain's wasn't. And Cain couldn't handle that for whatever reason. So instead of Cain going, "What did I do wrong?" or "What can I learn from Abel or learn from this situation?" instead, he just gets angry. And there's something very human about this, because sometimes rejection doesn't just feel like something I did wasn't good enough. It then becomes, I, as a person, am not good enough. So when we read criticism or rejection as an attack on our identity, our brain immediately wants to start defending itself. And that defense oftentimes comes out as anger. So like, think about getting criticized at work, or someone gets promoted instead of you, or your sibling always was the praised one, or someone else gets the relationship, the career, the house, the paycheck, or an opportunity that you wanted. And so suddenly their success starts feeling like evidence as though you are a failure. And that is where the trap happens, because just because Abel got his offering accepted doesn't mean that Cain had no value. God literally gave him a way out, right? He says, "If you do what is right, will you not be accepted?" So there's still an opportunity for Cain hasn't been completely, permanently rejected, but wounded pride can make correction feel like humiliation. So basically, instead of changing himself, Cain attacks the person he's comparing himself to. Okay, so the second behavior is externalization, which basically means something's happening inside of me, but I decide you're the problem. And interestingly enough, we do see this in Cain's family already. When Eve took a bite of the apple, she gave it to Adam. Adam took a bite as well. They're both at fault. God said, "Don't do it." And when God came and asked Adam, "What did you do?" What did he do? Blame Eve, right? So we already see this pattern of blame, of externalization happening. So instead of dealing with what's happening inside of me, we focus on what is wrong with everybody else. And once you convince yourself that someone else is responsible for your pain, resentment gets very easy to justify. And I also think that we do that as well when we blame God for the things that we do. Okay, so the third behavior I think is the most disturbing out of the whole story, and that is willful blindness. Because Cain was warned, God directly asks, "Why are you angry?" He points out the emotion. Then he says, "Sin is crouching at your door," which is, pay attention to where this is going, where this is going to lead you. And Cain ignores it anyway. And I think that we all do this on a much smaller scale. Like, you know that you're becoming bitter towards someone, or you're obsessively comparing yourself to other people. And that's when the warning or conviction comes that something isn't right, but instead of dealing with the problem, we oftentimes feed it. And eventually something that just started out as an emotion then becomes a pattern, a way of thinking, a way of life. And I think that's something so powerful about the description that God used. Sin is crouching at your door. It's like a predator waiting outside. It hasn't taken you over yet. It hasn't taken Cain over yet, but it's waiting. He can still respond differently. God said you must rule over it. So your emotions are real, but they don't automatically get to decide what you're going to do next. Underneath all three behaviors is something that scripture talks continuously about, which is the condition of the heart. Cain's story starts internally before it heads out externally. First, it's an issue with God, then it's rejection, comparison, anger, jealousy, pride. He ignores the warning, and then he isolates Abel. He gets defensive, and that is progression. In the book of James, he describes this exact pattern later in the Bible. It says in James 1:14-15, a person is tempted when dragged away by their own desire, and After desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. So in other words, actions just don't appear out of nowhere. Thoughts grow, resentment grows, jealousy grows, anger grows. And that's why God confronted Cain at the anger stage and not after the murder. And one thing I really want to drive home is that God warned Cain first, right? So Cain actually had an opportunity to change his mind. God saw exactly where his anger was going way before Cain ever killed Abel. And the reason I'm bringing this up again is because Romans 2 talks about how God's law is written on our hearts and our conscience bears witness to us. So basically, there's something inside each and every person, whether you're a Christian or not, that goes, I think that this isn't right. So how many opportunities do we get to change our ways before we do something permanently destructive? But then we choose not to. Okay, so what does a murder that happened thousands of years ago have to do with us? The mental patterns. The mental patterns behind what Cain did are extremely normal. They happen in each and every one of us in every single day life. However, the difference is what you choose to do with those emotions. God gave us emotions. They're perfectly okay to have. You're supposed to feel sad when it's time to feel sad, happy, joyful. Ecclesiastes says that there's a time to love and a time to hate, a time to be silent and a time to speak. So all of these emotions are normal, right? But it's just what we decide to do with them that could end up being destructive. It's good to look into ourselves and say, who bothers me when they get something that I don't have, or whose success is making you question your own value. We need to remember that our identity is rooted in Christ and not these external things. Our emotions, our thoughts, we need to bring it to God before it becomes bitterness, and bitterness becomes hatred, and hatred then becomes how you treat someone. So pay attention to your mind before your behavior catches up to it, because the Bible's first murder did not begin in a field. It began in the mind. So guys, if any of this challenged you, or if you have anything that you would like to share, please let me know in the comments because I would love to read it. And if you do like this type of content, please subscribe because I do post every single week. Until then, keep allowing God to transform you by changing the way you think.